Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show, final hour. Our next guest, good friend of the show, who is also listening to that interview with the Lieutenant Governor, it's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Chad. How are you?
Doing pretty good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm going through my notes here from what was said on your show as well as the Mark Davis show this morning. It seems like the Lieutenant Governor had some ground to make up with conservatives. He certainly felt that way after yours and Mark's shows last week, and the reaction from conservative listeners who, of course, I'm hesitant to say were formerly the Lieutenant Governor's base. I think they're still his base, but he's really made them angry. Certainly in DFW and Lubbock, and I can't imagine that it's any different in Houston or San Antonio or anywhere else in Texas.
Yeah, Scott, and I haven't even begun to analyze and look back on what he said about Empower Texans, so I'll let you do that here in just a second. But the Lieutenant Governor, I'm trying to think of a time where and I think it's okay for me to say this, the Lieutenant Governor seems to be on an island by himself without, I can't remember a time where he's been there. I mean, normally the grassroots, they're right behind him. Conservatives, right behind him. Even Republicans who may not like him, they at least have a foot behind him and they say, okay, well, yeah, we like you on most issues. He seems to me right now to be just on an island by himself on this issue. Am I wrong?
I think that's right. On the bathroom bill, I would say that conservatives were sort of tentatively behind him. They weren't against him, but they weren't all fired up, in favor of it. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
But Democrats certainly don't trust that the Lieutenant Governor really wants to do something about gun control. And, of course, the right is saying that, he's now sounding a lot like somebody who's a gun grabber like Beto O'Rourke, O'Rourke who, by the way, just went all the way in on this stuff. He's, selling T-shirts that say, we're going to confiscate your AR-15 and your AK-47 after, of course, O'Rourke had a very different take when he was on your show running for Senate last year. But, look, Patrick all by himself. And interesting that he's talking about polling that backs him up. This morning on the Mark Davis show, he said that polling is not why he's doing this because he thinks it's it's the right thing to do, which, as I have pointed out many times, anytime he says it's the right thing to do, he's about to tell you about a poll that backs him up. But the reality is that two things can be true at once, Chad. I mean, one, I think you heard in the Lieutenant Governor's voice on the radio this morning that he's genuinely moved by what happened in Odessa and in El Paso. He talked about the fact that he and Governor Abbott have gone and visited with these folks who have lost loved ones in these mass shootings, and he agrees that you have to do something on guns. Now, what that something is, he's landed on this expansion of background checks, which conservatives don't like at all. I think on your show it was running, 9-1 or more than that?
Yeah.
At 10 to 10, all 10 of the callers who might call in.
I've had one
Anybody
today.
like
I've had one today that likes the idea.
Yeah. So if there are more conservatives who like this, I'd like to know who they are. The Lieutenant Governor said that he had only talked to one person who didn't like his proposal, which I found interesting. The other thing that's true, though, is that it seems to be that he's made the calculation only November matters in 2020. It seems that the primary isn't going to matter. That's very convenient for him since he's not on the ballot. He doesn't have to run a primary. But it seems that he wants to see Republicans unite behind an idea that the grassroots doesn't like in order to save the skin of a very select group of Republican legislators who are going to be in tight races next year. I mean, self-preservation is the name of the game in politics, and when you look at the fact that in the Texas House you might have 8 to 12 seats that would really be contested in November, I don't think all of the other Republicans who are in the caucus are going to walk the plank. Like, say they had a special session on this and they put forth some gun control measures, which I don't think there's real appetite, in the governor's office to do a special session. But let's just say that they did, because that's the only way they could vote on something before the next election. If they did, Do you think all the other Republicans are going to get on board with gun control just to save the skin of 9 to 12 other Republicans? They're not going to do that because they know that they have a primary election coming up next March. And the grassroots, you're hearing from them on the radio, you're seeing it online. They're not happy with what the lieutenant governor is saying at all. Here's something that could happen, Chad. Let's say they have a special session after the primary. Then they could vote on something like this to try to preserve a Republican majority if the governor and lieutenant governor really do believe that this is what they need to do. But after all the work that they did during the regular session to try to keep things focused on school finances and property taxes, this gun issue has really crept up on them. And if the election was held today, it'd be front and center in those districts.
Yeah, I mean that's what I keep going back to. The lieutenant governor, he wants to have these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of any Republican House member that wants to have a discussion right now.
Yeah, I don't see a bunch of them crying out for it. I think they're expecting someone to lead on this. I would guess that if they did polls in those suburban districts, if you're talking about Collin County, Denton County, Fort Bend County, et cetera, where Republicans saw their margins of victory narrowed down to 2 and 3%. If you did polling there, especially with the suburban Republican women, this issue is one where the voters want to see something done. Now, we may have talked about this on the show, but I was told, my sourcing indicates, that when the Texas Senate GOP caucus had a conference call about this, all the Republican senators on the phone together, and they were asked, what could you support as far as gun control? None of them could think of anything because we know that the grassroots is not for that, and it's because they've been told by the NRA and by radio talk show hosts, et cetera, over the years that if you do anything on gun control, it will mean that the next thing that happens is everybody's gun gets taken away. And whether that's true or not, I'm not even going to debate it with you right now. It doesn't matter. Whether it's true or not, that's what Patrick's base believes, and so when he goes on the radio and tries to say that's not going to happen, they don't believe him because he's one of the people who's been saying it for years.
Right. Visiting with Scott Braddock, editor, Quorum Report. Scott, there were also some shots taken at Empower Texans by the lieutenant governor. Were you surprised by any of those?
Well, surprised or not, I was rubbing my hands together. I saw that the lieutenant governor was saying that they are engaged in crazy talk and the tactics of the left, which is fascinating. The lieutenant governor has been joined at the hip with Empower Texans on one issue after another, whether it came to property taxes and the tax caps and all of that, on pro-life issues, on fiscal responsibility, et cetera. And the lieutenant governor has gone to the extent of allowing Empower Texans to be on the floor of the Texas Senate as media during the legislative session when the Texas House did not allow that because Empower Texans, it's a group that contributes millions of dollars to try to defeat or elect candidates in elections. And that's been the bright line, for not allowing people on the floor. And now they're just eating him alive. It's fascinating to see. But, the lieutenant governor sort of made this bed. He's having to fight with Empower Texans. But let's get real here. He got $300,000 from them when he ran against David Dewhurst, and they helped to put him over the top when he ran for lieutenant governor. And so he probably felt somewhat beholden to them. But as soon as he was the nominee for lieutenant governor, all the rest of the mainstream, fundraising apparatus in this state for Republicans came on board with him. Other big Republican contributors who had not been for him up to that point, they all came on board and started giving him millions of dollars to fill his coffers with. And so he hasn't really needed Empower Texans or those groups since he got the nomination back in 2014. And the fact that he's still been doing their bidding over 2 legislative sessions, he is beholden to them. And so when he calls them crazy, it's a bed that he's been happy to be in up until now.
What?
For whatever reason. He doesn't need them.
Yeah.
Business groups will tell you that it's very frustrating that you have the lieutenant governor so beholden to these guys who helped him, try to push the bathroom bill and, wrap this state around a light pole for 18 months in 2017. Absolute national embarrassment, causing businesses to say that they might not come to this state. And he was still in bed with them, in bed with guys like Steve Hotze, who's another one of his contributors and longtime business partners. And for him to be bucking those people now is making a lot of people laugh because he just didn't need them for years.
And again, and the lieutenant governor said on my show, and I'm sure he said it on Mark's as well this morning, he talked about GOP unity.
Yeah.
And Scott, I heard your Texas, your podcast this weekend. There is no unity right now. I mean, with what's going on with the secret audio. And listen, I agree with the lieutenant governor. We need the audio released. The audio, if it were to be released, it would answer so many questions, and everybody could move on. I agree with them on that. But that's just one part of the disunity. The other disunity that we now have out there that I don't think anyone would have predicted 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, is the lieutenant governor being on an island by himself and the NRA disagreeing with him and conservatives disagreeing with the lieutenant governor. I mean, that's another a fight, and maybe a bigger fight than what's on the Bonin deal, right?
I think that's right. I mean, you have the lieutenant governor at war with the NRA. It's interesting that this morning he said that that it was the fake news media that said that he was bucking the NRA, but then, of course, the next thing he says the NRA is wrong about the issue. You've got the lieutenant governor trying to tell Empower Texans to sit in their corner, that they are the ones who are, quote, destroying the Republican Party. You have the possibility that John Cornyn will have a primary challenge, and who knows how that will go. I think that Cornyn would win the race. You have the Republican Party of Texas with a chairman's race right now, where the Speaker Bonin issue is front and center, because you have one of the candidates, Alan West, the former congressman, saying that Bonin needs to resign. And the chairman right now, James Dickey, saying that, we need to take a more cautious approach here and see what the Texas Rangers come up with. You've got the State Republican Executive Committee divided on a 31-29 vote about whether the Republican caucus ought to, consider getting behind someone else for Speaker. And I'm just sort of, skimming the top here, Chad, but you're exactly right. There is no unity within the Republican Party. If they thought that they could tell the grassroots to sit in their corner and basically shut up because we need to focus on the November elections and beat Democrats, that's just not going very well so far.
Speaking of the Democrats, what are they doing? Are they doing it? Or are they just sitting back and watching this play out and think to themselves, we couldn't have this any better right now?
I think that's at least part of it. I know that they're organizing. They've put together a plan to try to, win Texas in 2020. And when I was at the SRAC meeting a couple of weekends ago, you had the chairman, Mr. Dickey, who I mentioned, sharing polls with grassroots leaders saying, look, if you had the election today, Texas would be very competitive. I mean, he was showing SRAC members polling that indicates that some of the top contenders for the Democratic nomination would beat Trump in Texas today if the election was today. Now, he's not making a prediction that that's going to happen. What he's saying is Republicans have a lot of work ahead of them, to try to stick together. And Dickey's one of those who's talking about unity. He says you got to stick together and work against Democrats. And I think, you've made this point before, Chad, that the Speaker Bonin scandal in and of itself, that would not matter to average voters out there. They probably don't know anything about it. It's down in the weeds, and who cares? That is, of course, unless the speaker gets indicted, then that's a pretty easy headline. But we'll see what the Texas Rangers come up with. But the fact is that you've got the SRAC fighting with each other about that. That means the grassroots are fighting with each other about that. And the lieutenant governor this morning just in combat mode with Empower Texans. It's an amazing time, and unity is not the theme of the day.
Yeah. All right, Scott, tell folks what they can find at Quorum Report moving forward this week.
Well, we'll see what's going on with state agencies, with state government. We never bother you with fake news. It's only real news, and you can sign up for our email alerts there at quorumreport.com. For our free email alerts, just enter your name, and again, never ever fake news, just the real news about your state government at quorumreport.com.
Very good. As always, Scott Braddock, editor, Quorum Report. Appreciate your time, and we'll visit with you next week.
Talk soon, Chad. Thank you.
See ya. That's Scott Braddock, editor, Quorum Report.